Every revolution has its soundtrack. The American Revolution had patriotic music. The anti-war revolution had classic rock. The civil rights movement had jazz. As jazz music reached its peak popularity in the 1940s, many popular African-American musicians became key civil rights activists, simultaneously breaking barriers in both music and American civil liberties. In the 1860s, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments ended slavery in America, granted equal protection, and guaranteed the right to vote respectively. Around this time, New Orleans was already a hub of African American activity. Here, many African Americans were free before slavery was abolished. However, they were now seeing more and more oppression through new laws enforcing segregation, such as the Plessy v. Ferguson Acts, saying that African Americans must be in equal but separate train cars and other public facilities. Though freedom was guaranteed, many barriers drove inequality between white and African Americans. Despite this oppression, music was thriving. It was in the 1880s when the earliest form of jazz was born, most likely by an African American man named Buddy Bolden. For years, jazz music was played just at local restaurants and bars, but eventually it made its way out of New Orleans into the average American household, reaching white audiences. With this change, the Jazz Age started. Spanning from about 1920 through the 1940s, this era showed increasing African American acceptance as many jazz musicians started to become famous. They would normally never be allowed to perform in large concert halls, let alone have their own nationally sponsored television shows. These musicians had undeniable talent. Towards the end of this jazz age, these popular jazz musicians who broke the color barrier in popular entertainment helped pave the way toward the cultural revolution known as the Civil Rights Movement. I visited Carnegie Hall and spoke with Alexander Kaufman, a jazz pianist and an education administration coordinator.
Why did jazz musicians become civil rights activists? It's because they had to.
Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald were trailblazers of jazz and opened up the doors of racial equality that enabled the origins of the civil rights movement. They both grew up in abject poverty, experiencing outright racial discrimination. But by the late 1930s, they were some of the most popular music icons in the country. They initially avoided being controversial and focused on their careers. Dr. Neil Wetzel gives more insight.
Louis Armstrong, although he was a great musician, by some of the younger musicians was considered sort of an Uncle Tom at the time. They thought that he really didn't say enough against oppression.
Throughout their careers, they set a new mindset of African American acceptance. This set the foundation that civil rights leaders would later build on.
African American musicians were the first African Americans that were often brought into white households. And it's kind of interesting to think that these all-white households were making this African American rich.
In 1958, Ella Fitzgerald won the first Grammy Award presented to an African American, setting a cornerstone of professional acceptance that was followed by several African American artists. Towards the end of their careers, Armstrong and Fitzgerald were indeed vocal. Their popularity gave them a stage that reached Americans everywhere. After students were banned from a public school in Little Rock, Arkansas, known as the Little Rock Nine, Armstrong was so appalled that he was quoted saying, "The way they're treating my people in the South, the government can go to hell." Born Eleanora Fagan, Billie Holiday grew up singing along to early icons such as Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald. At age 10, she was sent to the House of the Good Shepherd, an abusive facility for troubled African American girls, for the sole reason that her single mother could not find employment. Holiday was discovered singing at a nightclub in 1933 and grew in popularity through the 1940s. She could not shake the oppression she experienced everywhere.
Billie Holiday was working with Artie Shaw. Interesting, when she would tour with them, she couldn't stay in the same hotel as the rest of the band. She couldn't even enter into the building in the same door because there were black doors, African American doors, and whites only doors.
In this time, she made her most powerful songs, such as Strange Fruit, which was denied by her record company at the time because it was graphically depicting the lynchings in the South. She also made multiple powerful songs about stormy relationships. helping sexism awareness. Nina Simone, another female jazz icon, also helped to depict the oppression that was happening to African Americans and women all throughout the U.S. Simone found her talent for the piano early in her childhood and used competition money to attend the prestigious Juilliard School of Music, but could not afford to finish. She then applied to Curtis Institute of Music, where she was allegedly denied because of her race. She wrote many civil rights songs, such as Mississippi Goddamn, which shared her disgust in response to the bombing of a church, killing 4 little girls, and the assassination of civil rights activist Medgar Evers. In the South, this album was greeted with riots and public burnings of this album. Carnegie Hall keeps a now rare first release of this LP in its archives. Another one of her songs, For Women, helped portray the oppression felt by African American women. Miles Davis was both a revolutionary jazz artist and passionate civil rights activist. Miles did not grow up in abject poverty like Louis Armstrong or Billie Holiday. Instead, he grew up living a relatively comfortable life, but Miles quickly learned that this did not mean he was exempt from prejudice. One day, Miles was walking on the street in front of the Apollo Theater at which he was scheduled to play. In front of this club, he was simply talking with a white woman when a white police officer approached him.
Kind of set off the policeman, and the policeman told him, "Come on, move along, get out of here." And Miles pointed up and said, "Well, that's me playing tonight." And the cop would have none of that, and basically started to beat him up, to take him in, and brought him in and arrested him.
Miles was scarred from this, and from that day, he always had a racially integrated band. He supported the NAACP and the Black Power movement, and frequently spoke out against black entertainers who pandered to white crowds. Davis wrote many of his songs in response to racial prejudice, including Half Nelson, supporting Nelson Mandela's anti-apartheid activism. This cover features multiple African American people only half clothed, which is not culturally acceptable in the 1960s. Another deeply immersed jazz artist who helped break African American norms was Sammy Davis Jr. From an early age, he started taking tap and voice lessons through his father. When World War II rolled around, he faced much oppression in his life. Drafted as a private, his marksmanship far surpassed his superiors, yet he was racially harassed and beaten by his fellow comrades, but only started being shown respect after he started performing for them. In the next decade, he built a career for himself as part of the Rat Pack. As he gained fame, many clubs across the country invited him to play, but he made it clear that he would not perform in any racially segregated club. He married Swedish actress May Britt in 1960 when interracial marriage was illegal in 31 states, and President Kennedy requested that the couple not attend his inauguration as not to anger the Southerners. Davis was also an active participant in the 1963 March on Washington. Breaking barriers. Through their talents and actions, these and other jazz musicians used their music to boost African American civil rights. Artists such as Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald planted the seed of African American acceptance into people around the United States as they were listening to them and bringing them into their own homes. Billie Holiday and Nina Simone used their songs to face a mirror to the general public, exposing them to the oppression of African Americans. Other artists, such as Miles Davis and Sammy Davis Jr., broke barriers in regular African American norms and changed the understanding of what people thought of African Americans in general. In the opening of the 1964 Berlin Jazz Festival, Martin Luther King Jr. made a speech entitled On the Importance of Jazz. He says, "Jazz speaks for life. The blues tell the story of life's difficulties, and if you think for a moment, you will realize they take the hardest realities of life and put them into music, only to come out with some new hope or sense of triumph. Much of the power of our freedom movement in the United States has come from this music."
That's the beauty of this music, is that it's still breathing and it's still alive. And it's gonna change. Jazz in the civil rights movement is huge, but we're always gonna have different movements as the entire world develops. And we are always going to have jazz, as many other art forms will be, to help us keep pushing through this.